ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for watching the show. This is your Top Think Tanks review, and I'm your host, Bryce Dolan. Now today on the show, we're going to look at 5 different top 50 United States think tanks and look at the top stories from each one of their websites. To begin our show today, the Urban Institute discusses the issues of sales tax for online shopping. Whether shopping on Black Friday, Cyber Monday, or any other day of the year, Americans increasingly purchase things online. The Census Bureau estimates that e-commerce is roughly 8% of all retail sales, up from 3% in 2006. Looking specifically at holiday shopping, trade groups estimate nearly half of all gifts are bought online. This matters to state governments because many online retailers, unlike brick-and-mortar stores, often do not collect state sales taxes. It's not that states intentionally favor online retailers, but rather a side effect of states creating their sales taxes generations before the internet. A Supreme Court case, Quill Corporation versus North Dakota, brought by catalog retailers, held that states could not require companies to collect sales tax on goods unless the company had a physical presence or nexus in the buyer's state. So whenever you purchase something online from a retailer not located in your state, chances are the tax is not collected. This costs states billions in revenue, putting additional stress on state budgets. However, and this is important if unpleasant, you, the consumer, still owe tax on the purchase. If you live in a state with a sales tax, only 5 states do not have one, you live in a state with a use tax, a tax on goods purchased outside your state of residence for consumption in your home state. A state's use tax is the same rate as its sales tax, but the consumer, not the seller, is obligated to report the tax. Some states like California and Utah make this easy by including a line for this tax on income tax forms, but few consumers actually pay the use tax. Still, despite federal inaction, some states are beginning to see more sales tax revenue from online purchases as the biggest online retailer moves into more locations. Amazon, in an attempt to cut down on shipping time, is building more distribution centers. Putting a building in a state establishes the physical nexus that triggers sales tax collection. Every time Amazon opens a warehouse or data center in a new state like Colorado, they begin collecting the tax. These locations mean purchases are taxed, but also allow the retailer to offer same-day or even 2-hour shipping. In total, Amazon now collects state sales taxes in 29 states and the District of Columbia. So odds are you'll pay sales tax on some of your online shopping this year. And even when you don't, you still owe your state the tax. So I was completely oblivious to this, ladies and gentlemen. I had no idea about the use tax. I do buy several things off of Amazon myself, but I didn't even consider sales tax. I mean, this is huge, and obviously it's huge. It's costing states billions in revenue because they're missing out on these sales taxes. And you know, it may not seem like that much to us because it's a couple bucks here and there, but a couple bucks per every single person in the state amounts up to that billions of dollars very quickly. So make sure when you're doing some online shopping this year, you keep an idea of if there's that retailer is in your state or not, because you, as the buyer, must report the use tax if you don't get charged the sales tax. So we're gonna make that our hashtag for the day, because I think we need to advocate for it, because I had no idea about it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who didn't know that they were supposed to report that tax. So we're gonna make that our hashtag with hashtag sales tax use tax. Next, according to the Brookings Institution, Fidel Castro's passing symbolically ends the long era of strongman rule in Cuba that was already in the rearview mirror. Cubans may now breathe a little more freely as they adjust to life without El Comandante peering at them from the pages of the state newspaper. But the post-Fidel transition process had already begun 10 years ago, when he stepped down from power due to a serious illness. Change, therefore, is likely to happen only gradually under the pragmatic hand of his younger brother Raul at age 85, who has promised to step down from office in 2018. The big question is whether the faction of the Communist Party leadership that is most loyal to Fidel will retain an outsized influence in slowing down or blocking economic and political reforms. Their influence was on full display at the last party congress in April, just 1 month after Obama's visit, when a series of modest but nonetheless progressive reforms were scratched. The old Revolutionary Guard remained at the top and intra-party debate was squelched. Since then, the reform process has stalled, in part due to the government's decision to dampen the growth of the emerging private sector, and the economy is nearing recession. In the coming weeks, we should watch carefully whether Raul and his supporters use Fidel's death to extend the late Comandante's status and anti-United States legacy, or continue and even accelerate the reform process Raul launched in 2008 and 2009. Initially, the public display of mourning and affection for Fidel's paternalistic rule will likely help rally the masses and boost the party's control. But beyond that temporary phase, Fidel's death presents the most important opportunity in decades to steer Cuba onto a path of sustainable development, unburdened by an orthodox and outdated view of caudillo politics, one that allows the Cuban people a larger voice in the decisions that affect them. Coincidentally, Fidel's death also comes at a critical moment of political change in its so-called enemy next door. The wrong response from Washington, one that tries to exploit the demise of Fidel to tighten the screws of the embargo against Cuba, would probably solidify the Fidelista wing of the party. It would repeat the same mistake made at the end of the Cold War, when U.S. policymakers tried and failed to force the collapse of the Castro regime as it struggled to cope with the end of Soviet subsidies. A hostile U.S. approach might also encourage Havana to turn more seriously towards Moscow and Beijing as lifelines in times of trouble. Instead, Washington should carefully consider the changing circumstances on the island and the building blocks already in place to improve bilateral relations and modernize the Cuban economy. A better approach for the incoming Trump administration would be to maintain President Obama's policy of constructive engagement and work with the post-Castro leadership to protect U.S. national interests in a more stable, independent, and open Cuba. Now, we've seen both reactions to Fidel Castro's recent passing. We've seen mourning. The city of Havana has essentially shut down for a number of days to mourn Fidel's death. But then in Miami, here in the United States, Cubans are celebrating in the streets of his passing. So you have apples and oranges here. You got half of the Cuban population who was exiled because of Castro, extremely happy because he's gone, and then you got the people still in Cuba who are extremely sad that he has passed. So it's a very conflicting situation. Next, Human Rights Watch says the Chinese government used intimidation in Tibet. Chinese authorities in the region increasingly speak and act as if Tibet were the epicenter of violent conflict. Earlier this month, the People's Armed Police carried out region-wide drills involving hundreds, if not thousands, of police and paramilitary soldiers. Afterward, state media waxed rhapsodic about the courage of the broad masses of soldiers in eliminating unseen threats, their perfect technique and high level of military training, and their courage in defending home and country, keeping the peace, and dealing with terrorist attacks and sudden incidents. At other times this year, the official media has also broadcast training exercises by special police and paramilitary units, in which the targets appeared to be ordinary vehicles or private homes and the enemies were civilians. China's security forces, like security forces everywhere, are entitled to conduct training exercises wherever needed for genuine national security reasons. But these militarized displays of force and rhetoric do not appear intended to address a potential threat, but to send a message that lethal force will be the response to any form of protest or opposition. Massively exaggerating the threat the government faces can only add to Tibetans' sense of alienation from the state and increase popular discontent. China does face low-level popular dissent and protests in Tibet, but its use of public and mass intimidation is no way to address it. So, again, the Chinese going with some not so ethical practices to show that if there's protests, they're going to have it taken care of. The people in Tibet have protested before against the Chinese government, so essentially they're having these drills and exercises to show, hey, if you protest again, these guys are more than prepared to take care of you. And unfortunately, that is not the right way to go about it. Now, just a short update on Syria from the Council on Foreign Relations. Forces aligned with the Syrian government took control of strategic rebel-held northern neighborhoods in Aleppo in what monitors have called the worst defeat for opposition since the government took half of the city in 2012. Russia's defense ministry said that Syrian government-aligned forces captured 10 neighborhoods and 3,000 buildings in a push backed by allied militias and the Russian Air Force. Kurdish forces, which are not aligned with the government of Bashar al-Assad, also captured a district from rebels. Thousands of families have fled as aerial bombardment continues. The northern neighborhoods in Aleppo were among the first areas to break free from government control when the country's uprising began. So as the battle continues for Syria, as the bloody battle continues for Syria, we only hope that it gets close to a conclusion, close to an end, as we see the government forces taking more and more of Aleppo. Now, to end the show, Cameron Munter, president and CEO of the East-West Institute, explains why Mosul is important and what the liberation of Mosul means to Iraq.
Hi, I'm Cameron Munter, President and CEO of the East-West Institute in New York, and I'd like to talk to you about Mosul. I served in Mosul as a U.S. diplomat about a decade ago, so I think of Mosul now with great sorrow and think of the people I knew then. The battle that is underway for Mosul now promises to be difficult, and it promises to go in phases. The phase we're in now is a phase in which the forces from either Baghdad or from Erbil are crossing the Nineveh Plain to the east of Mosul, through the ancient villages of that region that are predominantly Christian, that have historically been tied to the powers that are further east. As the forces come to the river Tigris, they're going to find themselves coming up across a much greater challenge as they faced ISIS in the core of its redoubt, which is on the far side of the river where the predominantly Sunni people live. I fear for people I knew at that time who live in that city. This promises to be a bloody battle. And yet, even if the battle is successful, the real question that comes will be, how will Mosul be governed? If Iraq is to survive as a multicultural state, or at least a state that's more than a Shia state, Mosul has to be governed effectively and with the buy-in of the people who live there, in rule of law, in economic prosperity, in education, in policing. It has to be convincing to the people who live there, and it has to be the responsibility of the people in Baghdad to realize this experiment is more than just how a city escapes the clutches of ISIS and much more learns how to govern itself. It's much more a broader question that speaks to the future of Iraq. So the question arises, can Iraq survive if Mosul fails? This is what the world will be looking at in the days and the weeks to follow.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, you can find the link to all of these articles below in the description. If you click on the links, it'll take you to the respective websites and you can read these articles in their entirety. But that does it for the show today, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for watching the show. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel so you get notified every time a new video is posted. Give us a like on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. But thank you for watching the show, ladies and gentlemen. I was your host, Bryce Dolan.